Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 350 library systems across the US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the amazing authors that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, I am so excited to host New York Times bestselling author and National Book Award winner Jason Mott as he talks to us about writing and his award-winning book, I already messed it up. Can we start over? His award-winning novel, Hell of a Book. I know everyone's excited to get started. But before we begin, let me pause for one moment and give you all the standard housekeeping information that kind of keeps everything running smoothly, and then we'll get things rolling. So we have compiled some questions that were pre-submitted with registration, so thank you for submitting those. But you can also continue to submit questions during the talk by clicking that questions button that's below the live stream video. Keep in mind, there are a lot of you tuning in today, so we will get to as many questions as time allows. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today. Jason Mott is the author of 2 poetry collections and 4 novels. His first novel, The Returned, was adapted for television and aired on ABC under the title Resurrection. Since then, his novels that followed have received various accolades and acclaim. His most recent novel, Hell of a Book, won the Sir Walter Raleigh Award for Fiction winner, was a Carnegie Medals for Excellence long list nominee, and the winner of the 2021 National Book Award for Fiction. He lives in Hermitude in southeastern North Carolina. Welcome, Jason. Thank you so much for being here. How are you?
I'm terrific. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, my pleasure. So I want to jump off with the Hermitude line because, believe it or not, we had a lot of questions pre-submitted about it, even to the tune of what's it like living in Hermitude? What motivates you to live that way? How does living in Hermitude affect your life as a writer? How do you interact with people? And so I was under the impression that it was just you being kind of snarky because you live in a rural area. But is that, do you live in Hermitude? Do you want to tell people about the Hermitude line?
It's a little bit of both. Like, I do live in a very rural part of North Carolina. Like, I'm in a town of literally about 600 people. So very, very small town. So it is kind of out of the way. Like, no one accidentally shows up at my house. Like, you have to make an effort and a plan to come to my house. But yeah, I am a little bit of an actual hermit where I am very happy living alone. Like, I like being kind of out away from everyone, kind of by myself. It is something that is conducive to writing because, like, I spend it, like, I have a hard time socializing. I can do it, don't get me wrong. I can definitely socialize and have a good time, but I have a long recharge period that's required after socialization. And so for me, the hermitude, as I like to call it, is a great way to just kind of say that I like to be out there kind of, listening to my own thoughts for a while. I enjoy it though. It's a blast, and it does definitely help my writing.
Okay. Well, thank you for talking about that. I had to address it just because there were a lot of questions about it. People were very curious about that line in your bio. Okay, so I just want to give you a forewarning. I'm only going to ask questions by people named Kelly.
That's fair. That's very fair.
If you don't know the reference, sorry if you haven't read the book yet, but Kelly is a reoccurring thing in Hell of a Book. So
yes, very much.
I do want to start off with Maria from Yonkers Public Library. Maria said, is this online talk as wearisome to you as the various author appearances were to the protagonist in your book?
It's funny, like a lot of interviews I have, people often ask that. They're like, is it as bad as you make it out to be in your book? And the answer to that is, like, sometimes, again, I think a lot of it goes against my nature. Yeah, like, as I am, I'm very quiet, kind of, I'm an introverted, kind of shy person. I don't present that way often, but I really am. And so for me, online events are great because you do get, meeting people, doing public events, doing readings, things like that, like, they're a blast. Yeah, you do get the same questions a lot of the time, and you have to learn to kind of navigate that. But the fun of that is that somewhere along the way, I realized that for the person asking the question, it's the first time they've ever asked it, and it's very exciting. And so it makes it exciting for me. So I actually do enjoy these events. Like I really and truly do. I love talking to people about writing, about comic books, about all kind of things. And so yeah, like getting to engage with people and talk about things that I wrote or things that other people are writing and just discuss literature, which I've kind of spent my entire life devoted to. I think that's a blessing. I think I'm very fortunate to be able to do that. So I thoroughly enjoy it.
That's good to hear. I won't have to be worried for the rest of the event.
Not at all.
So Barbara is asking or saying, I would like to know the history behind Jason Mott, such as where he grew up and what schools he attended, also what prompted your passion for becoming a writer. So you currently live near or in the place that you grew up in, North Carolina, right?
Yeah, very much so. I mentioned the town that I live in and grew up in is a town called Bolton. It's in southeastern North Carolina. Like I said, it's probably 600 to 800 people, maybe. If someone's fudging the numbers, you might get 800 people. But I've lived here my entire life. I spent a couple years living in Greensboro, but not very long. I came back just because I enjoy it. People often ask, like, why don't you move somewhere else and a more populated area? And the answer is like I enjoy kind of the rural, quiet life. And so I lived here my entire existence. I did, elementary school, middle school, high school, all in the same county of Columbus County, North Carolina. I went to UNC Wilmington for undergrad and graduate. As far as how I got into writing, I was actually 14 years old, 14 or 15, somewhere in that general neighborhood. And I was taking an English class. And somewhere along the way in that class, we were given a small section of a novel called Grendel by John Gardner. And Grendel, as the novel written by John Gardner, is about the monster Grendel from the Epic of Beowulf. And I was a huge nerd at the time, as you could probably imagine. And Beowulf was one of my favorite heroes. Like he was the big guy with the sword who slayed dragons and monsters, and just he was everything I wanted to be, but was too introverted and shy and bashful to actually be. And so for me, Beowulf was always this epic, heroic, amazing kind of figure. And then John Gardner took that same narrative and turned it on his head, where he presented this narrative from Grendel's point of view, kind of the monster's point of view. And it made me look at Beowulf very differently. And I was so shocked by that. Like I remember reading it and I was so amazed that he had made me feel bad for the monster that I spent so much time like hating because it was the evil monster, that I remember reading it and I said, I want to make someone else feel this way one day. Like I want to do this to somebody else. I want to take something that they know and just have them vibrate after they read it, after, the world's kind of being expanded. So I started writing short stories at about 14. I didn't take it seriously until I was in my early 20s. My mother passed very unexpectedly, and that caused me to kind of reevaluate life and get very serious about my writing. But after that, I just kind of had laser focus and kept writing. And fortunately, things went the way that they did and kind of worked out for me.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, no problem.
I did get an email from a viewer named Anne. I don't know if she's viewing right now or she'll watch the recording later, but Anne says, please pass along that I choose books after reading the first page, sort of like Agents. And I read that first page over and over, savoring every word and the brilliant flow of the sentences. Or I read that first page of Hell of a Book. I would like to know whether the author outlines a story and then fills it in, or just writes to see where the story will go.
It's a good question. Also, Anne, I'm glad you enjoyed the first page. That's always good to know. So for me, my process is a mixture of two. It begins with an outline. Like almost every project I have starts with me outlining it. Usually I'll have an idea or a voice for a character in my head, but I won't know what to do with them. So I'll start trying to think of things to do, and I start outlining that. So I outline the entire project as close as I can. And then if I can manage to outline it, I know I've probably got a full project there, and I'll start working on it. But once I start working on it, after I get through the first draft, once I finish the first draft, then I'll throw the outline away and I just let the characters start changing and manipulating the story as they want to. It's almost like for me, the outline creates a rehearsal where I write the first draft, kind of rehearsing, hitting the plot points of the outline. But then once that's done, I throw that away and I let the characters improv, and I go back and I rewrite sections based upon how the characters are acting with one another and how that is influencing the story. So I guess for me, it's a hybridization of those two things. Like I think storytelling and writing in general, especially if you're doing big projects like novels and long form fiction, I think it has to be this balance between planning and improvisation. And so that's kind of how my process happens. It's begins very structured, but it becomes more organic the further along I get in it.
Very interesting. I always find it interesting when authors talk about characters kind of working with one another and how they play off of one another. And just like, it kind of, maybe not even a close reference at all, but it reminds me of playing with dolls when you're little. And
Yes.
like, or figures or something like that, and how the storyline goes in your imagination.
Yeah, I think it's the exact same thing. It's funny, like it becomes very organic where things do surprise me. So with Hell of a Book, for instance, the character of the kid, which, if everyone has read it, obviously the kid is a main part of the narrative. He's a huge part of the story. That character did not appear until very late in the process. That character was not in the outline, was not in the initial drafts. I literally wrote about 5 or 6 drafts of that novel as I was revising it and working on it. And that character was not there at all. And I was going through one of the revisions and I was trying to solve this problem of I had the author, the main character, in this hotel, but it felt like something was missing. And I said, he needs to have a conversation with someone. Like, who can he be conversating with? And I said, well, I don't know. What if he meets some kid in this, downstairs, and what kind of conversation would they have? And I just kind of started. So I put this character into the project and started having the author interact with that character. And that character just redirected the narrative of the story a bit and suddenly became essential and vital and arguably the core of the novel. But that character was not planned. It was not a character that I saw coming at all.
Wow. Very interesting to know. So you also said 5 or 6 drafts in. And Jordan just asked, what encourages you to keep writing when motivation is low? I could imagine 5 or 6 drafts in. At least I would think that exhaustion might be seeping in a little bit.
Yeah. So my encouragement for writing is, well, at this point, it's become habit. Like it's such a habitual part of my day and part of my week that I have to do my writing hours where I feel off. Like I just don't feel correct if I'm not writing. But the main encouragement is, like, for me, writing is, and kind of has always been, the way that I sort out the world that I live in. Like I said, I struggle with socialization. I struggle with engaging with people as much as I probably should. And, I turn the news on. I'm kind of over empathetic a lot of times. Like the news really bothers me and like it sticks with me and things kind of aren't able to be processed. And so writing has become the avenue through which I can process complex emotions and worries and anxieties and fears and all those negative things that if I did not have writing would be stuck inside, which is obviously not very healthy. And so for me, the encouragement I get for writing is just the wherewithal to know that I'll feel better once I've done it. Like I oftentimes don't want to do it, but when I'm finished writing, like I generally almost always feel better about myself. And I just kind of keep that as the motivation.
It's like exercising.
It's exactly what it is. It is exactly that.
Don't do it, but we'll feel better. Siobhan is asking, how is your poetry writing process different from your book writing process? In other words, when you have an idea that you want to capture, do you know it's going to be a poem or a book, or does it just show itself in the midst of writing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the main way that they differ, weirdly enough, poetry I have to write on paper with paper and pen. Like I cannot write poetry, at least the initial drafts, I cannot do on a keyboard. I don't know why. I've never tried to force myself in either route. I just know that when I feel myself grab pen and paper, like I know there's a poem coming. Whereas with my computer, like with my keyboard, I can do novels and nice stories and things like that. But as far as how they kind of influence each other and where the ideas form, usually my gut kind of tells me where something needs to be. Poetry I kind of reserve for trying to capture a specific emotion or a specific image or idea. And then when I start to see recurring ideas or images, that's when I know I probably got a short story or a novel coming up somewhere there. And I'll try to figure out what's going on to create those images. But it tends to be, if the poem, if I write 5 or 6 poems about the same topic, chances are my brain is circling around something it wants to solve on a bigger form, and that usually becomes a novel project or something like that.
Very interesting. Dietrich is asking about kind of character development. When you develop your characters, what's your process for ensuring that they're seen as multidimensional and no one characteristic kind of overrides the reader's view of them?
Ooh, that's a good question. There's a lot of different tips and tricks to that. There's no one method, but there's a lot of different things that I do to try to make sure that happens. So one thing I do early on in my process is I have a character biography worksheet that I do. I have to finish this sometimes with characters where it's an empty sheet. It's a kind of a template that I use for the characters where it is characters' height and weight and how old are they, where were they born? How are their parents? Do they like their parents? Are their parents friendly, or the parents stern? Like, I try to do as if it's almost like a dating profile, like a really in-depth dating or background check where I answer like a lot of weird questions. I try to answer questions like, what is this character's favorite hobby? Like, what kind of music do they like? What kind of music do they hate? Why do they hate that kind of music? And I start plugging in all these answers. And the more answers you plug in, the more well-rounded your character starts to become. And I also try to make sure I give every character something that I make sure every character has a want, like a very specific thing that they want or desire. I think that's the core of storytelling. Someone wants something, there's something keeping the person from the thing that they want. Like, that's conflict, and that's the story. So I make sure each character wants something, and then I try to figure out how do they keep themselves from the thing that they want, or is someone else keeping them from it? Because oftentimes we're our own worst enemy, and I think that creates magnetic, interesting characters, people who not fully self-sabotage, but who even oftentimes don't know the thing that they want, and they're just kind of drifting and they're looking for things. So I try to build that into my characters. I try to make sure my characters have conflicting interests and conflicting hobbies, and are characters who, they like Taylor Swift and they like death metal, try to make sure it's as far apart as they can, because I think that's how you create rich, vibrant people and characters.
Okay. So I want to transition to Hell of a Book. We have a lot of amazing questions, and I want to make sure that we have a chance to get to most of them. Hell of a Book is a novel that really kind of explores identity, love, and being Black in America. And I do want to break that down a bit with a couple of questions. But first, I'd love to invite you to kind of give a quick summary of the book. Not everyone that tunes in for the talks has read the book, so maybe summarizing without any spoilers.
Yeah, sure. So the basic pitch of Hell of a Book is a successful author has written a novel, and he is on book tour for that novel. Everyone that he meets tells him it's such a hell of a book that he is traveling around the country touring. As he is touring, he meets this 10-year-old kid who he simply nicknames the Kid, and they begin kind of, as he travels from city to city, this kid keeps showing up in all these different cities. During that period of time, there's discussion in the background. There's something rumbling in the background about some police shooting that has happened and some kid who has been murdered during a police shooting. And the author tries to explore that and he doesn't try to, he's kind of forced to grapple with the identity of who this missing kid is and the identity of violence and policing and minorities in America. That's the short, condensed version of the project.
Mm-hmm. And this was a book that you were kind of sitting with the idea for a while. What inspired it?
Yeah, very long. So it initially was inspired by my very first book tour. 2013, The Return came out. It was very successful, like way more successful than I think I or anyone else expected. And I got to go on a really long, busy book tour. So it was, every day was a new city, a new place, and you were just talking about your book, doing interviews. And it sounds really great, and it was really great. But at the time, it was really frenetic, really exhausting. For someone who is a homebody introvert like myself, it was kind of a system shock to be out there and to be constantly talking to people every single day. And there's a lot of silly, wacky things that happen along the way, a lot of weird misadventures. And so when I finished the book tour, I told my agent, I said, I want to write a novel. I said, well, my second novel should be about an author on book tour, because it's so crazy that nobody would believe the things that happen on book tour. My agent said, it's a terrible idea. And I was like, okay. So this goes on for 2 more novels. After my third novel was finished, my agent and I were talking, and she said, what do you want to write about now? And I said, I still want to write about an author on book tour. And we kind of haggled about it a little bit, and she said, you know, go do what you want to do. But also during this time, there was the Freddie Gray incident in Baltimore, Maryland. For those who can't remember, Freddie Gray was a Black man who was arrested, put into the back of a police transport vehicle, and given what the police call a rough ride. In this context, it means driving fast, braking hard, taking corners extremely fast. Meanwhile, Freddie Gray was in the back of this vehicle, handcuffed but not restrained in his seat. So he was allowed to bounce around the inside of this metal vehicle. He died due to injuries sustained during that period. Baltimore erupts. The country kind of watched Baltimore burn for a few days. And I had a really good friend who was living in Baltimore, who I've known for 20 some years now. Every morning at 7 a.m., I called him and we talked about, was he safe? How was his family? You know, what was going on there in Baltimore? How was he feeling? And he just kind of kept me up to date on it. And it began this discussion on policing and Rodney King and all these events that we witnessed in our life of, you know, as a Black man in America and a Black, you know, just Black person, minority in America in general, and kind of how we had buried it down and hadn't really thought about it. And just kind of here it was again, all of a sudden. And at the end of that time, about 2 weeks of that, I was really depressed. You know, who can imagine why? I was really depressed and down. And I was telling my friend, I said, I don't know what to do with all this. I said, you know, I said, it's all dredged up. It's kind of overwhelming me. It's getting the better of me. What do I do with this? And my friend actually said, hey, you know, you're a writer. Why don't you write something about it? I said, that's a pretty good idea. So I started writing these very small vignettes that were just about my feelings, but sometimes in character form. So they weren't planned to be a story. It was just things that I was thinking, and I tried to put a character behind them and see how these characters play out these emotions of mine that I was grappling with. And at the end of that, I had a huge stack of very sad papers of, you know, stories of Black violence and police violence and all these things. And I remember that also during that period, I had written this silly story about this author on book tour that somehow was missing something. So I took these two stacks of paper and essentially combined them together into this story that was both comedic and dark, you know, silly, but also very serious. And that became hell of a book. It was a really wild kind of journey for it.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I mean, that's such a big story for an inspiration for a book in very two different ways. So thank you for sharing that. In Hell of a Book, the main character, the author, is kind of really rebuilding his world every day. It seems kind of, you know, this response to psychological trauma of being Black in America. And Mara from Mill Valley Library is saying, I was struck by the main character's sense of disorientation that I didn't simply attribute to his drinking. I'm interested in why you made that choice and what it symbolizes.
Yeah, so that choice kind of came from a few different places. One of the places it came from is, you know, as I mentioned, I've been building stories since I was 14. You know, I was a big reader before that. So I've always had a bit of an overactive imagination. I'll say it that way. And I wanted to find a way to incorporate that into the story because, as I was saying earlier, how writing is the place where I go to sort through these heavy emotions and the things I see in the news and all these heavy things that I have. I use writing as the avenue for that. Writing is just that proxy for my imagination. So I was like, I wanted to have the character represent kind of how I see the world, but through his lens. Because I definitely spend a lot of my time just staring off, and, you know, I can be having a conversation with someone, and meanwhile, like, there's this buffer going in the back of my brain, just imagining all these other things and trying to build this story. Even as I'm living my daily life, the back of my mind is imagining something different and building this possible outcome and creating these narratives. And so I wanted a character who kind of lived in that space and I wanted to put that on the page, because the topics that I was trying to tackle and trying to talk about, they're not new topics. They've been discussed for decades, for hundreds of years, if you really want to kind of go back to American history. They've been discussed, but it's rare that Black voices are allowed to be farcical, even as they're being very serious. Like, there's the expectation that you have to discuss these topics in a very specific kind of way, like with a certain type of gravitas and a certain type of language and a certain type of finger pointing. And there's no room for laughter here. This has to be a very stern conversation. And that's not who I am as a person. So I said, well, I want to represent who I am and I live the life, so I want to represent that. And so for me, having the imagination be a part of it was putting myself out there and putting the comedy in it, the silliness that occurs in the book. That was also me trying to represent who I am and those people like me, those weird little outsider kids who grow into weird little outsider adults, who suddenly start telling stories.
Mm-hmm. Well, you were representing kind of the human experience, the human identity and existence. I mean, I know one of the things that I loved about the book was that, like, something us readers, I think as we're reading Hell of a Book, you begin to see the author kind of struggle with his Black identity, but it's not really until he's meeting with the PR agent that even comes about. So it was, yeah, I mean, the human experience was shown very well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Ivy is from Edith Wheeler Memorial Library, says, did you have an imaginary friend like the kid or an alter ego growing up? Was there something or someone else who helped you through childhood?
Hi, Ivy, first off, good, nice to meet you. Secondly, for me, it was very much, I didn't have so much an imaginary friend or alter ego, but I definitely lost myself in books. Like, I lived in the world of my books very, very much. I was the kid who was bullied on the bus every day. Like, I hated going to school because, like, I was the kid who never fit in. Like, I just never fit into any group. I was too much of this thing, not enough of that thing. And so the bullies from all facets of bullyhood kind of found me and made me their kind of prey for just years upon years upon years. And the escape was books. Like, I would be on the bus reading Beowulf, reading comic books, reading anything I could kind of escape into. And I kind of lived there very much. Large chunks of my day was, even when I wasn't reading, I was still mentally in that place. And because it was a better, kind of safer place to be. And so even though there wasn't per se a imaginary friend or any kind of like figure in that form, that imaginary world was kind of the place where I lived. And I think it's still a place where I live a lot now. I funneled it into the page, but it's still very much the place where I kind of exist. When the quote unquote, the real world gets to be a bit too much, or it just is what it is. That is still the place where I go to kind of seek safety and solace and to really feel at home.
Mm-hmm. To follow up, Kathleen is asking if any of the characters in Hell of a Book are based on yourself, or if you've experienced the things that you're talking about in Hell of a Book. I mean, I know that Bolton is represented in the book. Are there any other places there?
Yeah, very much so. So one of the funny things about Hell of a Book is, at the core, is honestly about a 60 to maybe 70% memoir. A lot of Hell of a Book is pulled directly from my experiences and my encounters that I've had, and moments from my life. I'm trying not to do spoilers because there's people who haven't read the book yet, but there are huge scenes in that book that I either happened to me directly, or were things that happened in my town, or things that I got secondhand through my parents. Like, it is very much a semi-memoir in that regard. So yeah, there's very much a lot of me in that book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 60 to 70% memoir. That's amazing and tragic all at once. Alex is saying, why did you choose the hard-boiled detective voice for the author? I loved the voice and the book, and it would be great to hear how you came to choose that point of view.
Yeah, honestly, that came back. So I'm a huge fan of film noir, like I have been for decades. I love watching, any of those old black and white movies with the quick talking detective and all those kinds of things. Like, I just absolutely adore them. I think they're I'm always a sucker for language, like any kind of story or movie or book that uses language and dialogue in a very specific or a very different way just attracts me. So I love those things. And when I was working on Hell of a Book, I was watching a lot of film noir. I had gone back to it during this period where I was just kind of circling back to things I love. And I was rewatching a lot of film noir as I'm sitting there at the keyboard writing. And one day I'm sitting there, and I think I was watching, it wasn't Maltese Falcon. It was one of the others that with Bogart in it. But I just kind of I decided on a whim to like, what if the character talked that way? And I just started throwing that into the character's mouth as the character was in a scene. And as I did it, I just really had fun doing it. And I said, yeah, the hell with it. I'm gonna make this book fun. Like, it's already heavy and serious enough. I'm gonna have fun with it. So I kept that going, and it began to blossom into something that was even more kind of personal and unique and different. So yeah, it came from a really fun place. Like, that was one of the most entertaining parts of it, was working with the dialogue and the language and getting to kind of be tongue in cheek with things. I think it's so rare that I'm allowed to do that. So I had a blast doing it.
Well, it was laugh out loud funny. There were definitely times. So I read the book in print, but I also usually listen to the audiobook as well. So there, yeah, it was hilarious. So you write early on in Hell of a Book, never forget this is a love story. So I would like to explore that a little bit. Is it more of learning to love self or learning to love circumstance or even place? In all your books, you kind of seem to link back to North Carolina in some way. So I kind of read this love story as a kind of coming home that, while difficult, brought the author full circle.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. So I write about place more than I think I've actually realized. I'm working on a project right now that is actually more about place than I kind of expected it to be. And so for me, that love story angle, like, there are multiple love stories in Hell of a Book, but they're not in the traditional sense. And there's that line there, not just, again, this is going to kind of spoil a few things for people. I'm trying not to. Like, that line initially is meant to be a little bit of a red herring, but then as you continue through the project, it becomes more pertinent and more real as you kind of get into it. But it is about learning to love yourself. It is about learning to love the place that you're from, the people in your life. Like, it's about learning to love a lot of different things. It's very much a love story for sure, but probably not in the way people expect. And that's what the book wants to do. Like, the book wants to, show you one thing, but then lead you down a different path, like that. And that's part of the goal of it.
Dolores from Abington Township Public Library says, in quotes, "I have a condition," meaning what? By the end of the book, I was saying, don't we all? What were you going for? Limits of perception, multiple perspectives. Was his condition being a Black man in America? Please explain.
So I think you hit it right, hit the nail on the head. Like, I'm not going to give any definitive answer of this is what that particular sentence means, because I do think that's one of those sentences that is meant, like, it's meant to be a bit of an interpretive kind of statement. And so as the author, if I come in and say it's actually about X or Y, I kind of shut down the discussion. But I definitely will say that, that sense of having a condition, like, yeah, the author is not the only one that has a condition. Like, the main character that, people that come and encounter Hell of a Book, I think those for whom the book kind of resonates, I think it resonates because they also have a certain type of condition that they're kind of trying to navigate and put words to. And hopefully Hell of a Book is able to help put words to those kind of conditions, quote unquote.
Okay, so I want to talk about the Nick Cage part for a minute.
Let's do it. I'm here for it all day long.
So, first, it was completely unexpected. I don't know why.
Good.
But and as I said, I listened to both the audiobook and read the print copy, usually simultaneously. Like, when I'm driving, I just listen. And so, like, I started the Nick Cage part while in the car and was like, wait, is that like a Nick Cage voice that he's trying to do? And then, like, when it finally came out, and then I went and reread the whole thing. So where did this come from? I mean, it was very interesting. And the things that Nick Cage in the book were saying were completely believable to be kind of like this crazy out there thing that Nick Cage would say, but also completely like putting being Black in America in a very open and real perspective, like a way that I've never heard it said before. I mean, it was amazing.
Awesome. I'm actually really glad you asked that. Like, the story behind that is odder than people are probably going to expect.
Okay.
So here's the story behind that. Like, that was that happened on a dare, weirdly enough. And it happened in the 11th hour. The book was, we were literally about 2 weeks from sending the book out to publishers to try to find a home for it. And so 2 weeks before that, Nick Cage did not exist in the novel. There were Nick Cage references. There were Nick Cage jokes. Like there was definitely, because I'm a big Nick Cage fan in real life. And so there were a lot of inside jokes about Nick Cage and things like that. And I had wanted to, in my gut, I wanted to put a scene in there with Nick Cage, but I was like, you can't do that, can you? That's not legal. Like, I was like, of course you can't. So my agent and I were doing some late stage revisions. And there was a scene that she wanted me to take out, and I didn't want to take the scene out because I liked the scene and like I had worked on it really, really hard. But she said it didn't really fit. And my agent's really smart at what she does. She's really, really good. I've been with her for 12 years now. Like, so she's great. And there's a tone she gets when, like, it's kind of like mom. There's a certain tone she takes when she wants to like draw a line in the sand and say this thing needs to happen. So she said the scene needs to go. And I was kind of angry about it because I knew I was going to take her advice, and I was kind of angry. And I said, if I take this scene out, I'm putting Nick Cage in the book. And she said, I dare you. Huh? And I said, well, fine, then I will. Like, I had not intended to. So on that dare, I had about a week, and I went and I wrote the scene, and it came together so fast. Like, it came together in literally about 2 days. And it suddenly galvanized a lot of different things that the book had been missing that I didn't realize it had been missing. It brought into light a lot of arguments, a lot of discussions that were happening in the novel that this representation of Nick Cage was able to verbalize. And it also helped me understand why I actually like Nick Cage, weirdly enough. It helped me solve that riddle as well. And yeah, it was. And when I sent it back to her, she was just blown away. She's like, good job. And I was like, yeah, I don't know how that happened, but we'll go with it. And so, yeah, that scene, the fact that scene worked is one that it tickles me every day because it was not planned. It almost didn't happen at all. It happened on a dare and wound up working out. So I'm happy about that.
Yeah, that's amazing. I finished that scene after the second time, and it was just like, whoa, it's so good. Okay, so Beth is saying, I was fascinated by the weaving together of the author, Soot, and the kid, but I was very distracted throughout by the lack of explanation as to the content of the book for which he was touring. Why did you leave that out? On page 92, the author mentions one character named John that was based on the author's father, but then later said the book was about death and an attempt to cope, but no other information. Why?
So I love stories that kind of tease questions and leave not loose ends, but unanswered questions. I think there's a strong difference between those two things. A loose end is something that deserves and needs to be answered in order for the reader to have satisfaction. An unanswered question is one that you don't need the question answered for satisfaction, but you would like for it to be answered. And so I really engage with those kinds of things. And so that's kind of like the surface level of why that's in there. But for the character and for the story, the character is in a space where he's struggling with reality and the imagined spaces that he kind of exists in. He's struggling with what is real and what is not. And so for him, his everyday existence is a bit of an unanswered question. Like, he has moments where he knows he might not be able to trust the things that his senses and his mind are telling him are real and are existing. And so I wanted to have that same kind of mystery. I wanted to represent that mystery for the reader as well, where just as the author questions things that he sees and memories that he has, I wanted the reader to be like, yeah, on page so-and-so, they said this, but then on page X, they said this other thing, and like, which one is correct? That was all very intentional and very much meant to be interwoven. And it's funny, I was really worried about that when I finished the book and sent it to my agent. And even when it got published and people were starting to encounter it, because I was really terrified that the conflicting information that comes in the book sometimes, in the way that it does avoid answering certain questions and like contradict itself, I was worried people would bounce off of that because, a lot of people like a neat and tidy, give me the answers kind of story. And I knew that I was going to be intentionally ducking answers and depriving readers of things they wanted to know. But I was hoping that the other things that I was giving them would be so much larger and so much more important to them that they would be okay with it. but I wasn't sure. And so I was terrified the entire time that I was writing it and waiting for it to come out. And even once it was out, I was still afraid that people would bounce off of it or not understand what was happening. And thankfully, readers have encountered it, and it's kind of been the exact opposite, where people, don't get me wrong, there's definitely people who want to know, like, what was this thing here, what was this thing there, but they don't need that answer to be happy with the book. And I think, to me, that was my goal, to have it where I can have an unanswered question on the final page, but you don't even need that answer, and you're still happy with the book and happy with where you've been. I think, to me, that was my goal. When I can make that happen, I feel so happy.
Yeah, I liked the fact that I felt like it wasn't the point. The book within the book wasn't the point. The point was getting to the end, and the point was being stated throughout the entire book: the human experience, the Black experience in America, etc.
Yeah. But I will say, it was definitely part of teasing. That was definitely part of the fun too. I was kind of being a little bit sadistic in certain parts where I knew people would be wanting to know, what's this damn book about? And I was like, nope.
Like when you leave a line for the name.
Yes.
Mr. Bleep.
Yes, exactly. I did have a lot of fun with that. So I'm a little bit malicious in that regard.
That's okay. Catherine from Mahwah Public Library is asking, was there another title of your book you were considering before Hell of a Book? If so, would you share your writing process for the title?
Oh man, you guys are asking great questions. Like, these are great. And the reason that's a great question is a fun piece of trivia that you will never get asked, but a fun piece of trivia to know. I suck at titles. I have yet to title any novel that I have ever published. Every novel that I published has been titled by someone else. 2 of them have been titled by my agent. The other 2 have been titled by my editor. Hell of a Book was titled by my agent, and I fought that title every step of the way. I did not want that to be the title of the book. So the way that happened is, my agent and I, like I said, we've been together for a while. She knows I'm bad with titles. So as we were getting about a month away from trying to send it out to publishers, she said, hey, send me a list of titles, like give me like 10 titles and we'll see what we can figure out. And I said, okay, here goes. So I sent her like 10 titles, and a couple of days later, she emailed me back. She said, nope, try again. And I was like, okay. So she's shooting down these bad titles that I have. And so in the manuscript, as everyone has read it, if you have read it, the author in question has written a book, and everyone keeps saying it's such a hell of a book. So my agent one day came back. We were like maybe 3 days out from sending it out. She said, hey, why don't we just call it Hell of a Book? And I said, no. I said, we're not doing that. And my logic was, again, I'm a quiet, introverted kind of guy. And I remember when Dave Eggers' A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius came out, which is a very tongue-in-cheek title. But I remember walking to the bookstore and seeing that title and being like, how dare you, sir? Like, how dare you call your book that? And so for me, calling the book Hell of a Book was such a like arrogant kind of like chest out kind of way to approach it. I was like, that's not who I am. And so my agent said, she said, unless you have a better title, which I know you don't, I said, I think we should call it Hell of a Book. And so I said, if we're going to call it Hell of a Book, I said, I'll concede that, but I also want to have a farcical, satirical, like over the top, silly title as well. And so that's why, like, when you open up the first page, like the title page of Hell of a Book, it will say Hell of a Book, and there's like this long, winding, silly title. Yeah, there you go. So that's the case where my agent won, and I also kind of won, but the front of the book is Hell of a Book because my agent's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, when you title a book Hell of a Book, it better be hell of a book.
I know. That's what I told my agent. That's what I told her. I said, think about, if the critics get it and they don't like it, hell of a failure, hell of a bad attempt at writing. Like, there's so many ways. Yeah, there's so many ways to just serve up a bad review. And so, I was terrified, and like, I'm only just now becoming okay with it being called Hell of a Book. It's taking me a long time.
Well, I think you've received your affirmation that it is hell of a book. So it's okay. Okay, so Zaya from San Anselmo Public Library is asking, if readers have only one takeaway from your book, what would you want it to be?
Ooh, tough question. I think if there's one takeaway, it would be no group of people is a monolith. People come in all kinds of shapes and sizes and iterations. I think I think people often get reduced down to stereotypes or simplified versions, not necessarily stereotypes, but simplified renditions of who they are. We encounter someone, we make a flash judgment about what their life is like and who kind of person they are. And so for me, I think the takeaway would be that to remember that like people are complicated and complex in all walks of life. And there are, minorities struggling with policing and with violence and with all these topics that I think we can oftentimes become numb to, and we oftentimes think have been solved. Something will happen. There's a big protest. There's a lot of legislation for maybe a year, and then it fades away, and we think, okay, we solved that problem. Let's go on to other problems. And Hell of a Book wants to have a discussion about that. Hell of a Books wants to have a discussion about the aftermath that when a news headline comes up and we all key in and lock in on that headline and we follow the journey of it, and it goes to trial and things happen afterwards, and then it starts fading away. There are people in this world, family members, loved ones, friends, communities, for whom that story, that headline never went away. They live with the loss that occurred in that story, in that moment. And that never goes away. Like when some police shooting happens or some act of violence against certain people happens, the people who are affected by that violence, that moment never goes away. It never recedes for them. It never drops out of their news feed. It's always a part of their life. And they have to learn to be imaginative and create with that. And so that's kind of what Hell of a Book. And that's a long answer to that question. I'm sorry about that, but it's a tough question.
Okay. One takeaway is definitely a tough question. Excuse me. Taisha from Orange County Library System is saying, how do you find balance in writing as a Black man, writing about Black issues with the pressure that it comes with, along with the critiques of those in society who may have a hard time understanding your experiences and perspective?
Ooh, another tough question. It's really challenging. If you are any kind of minority, not just Black, but if you are a woman, if you are LGBTQ, if you are trans, if you are Asian American, if you are any kind of non-white male identity, and you write a story, even if the story is not about your identity, if it is about something completely different, if you're writing about aliens on another planet, sci-fi, whatever, it will almost always be viewed through the lens of whatever your identity is. And so for me, my race was always a part of the discussion, even when it was not a part of the books. It was, I wrote, the returns, the Wonder of All Things, The Crossing. Those are not stories about race. They're stories about characters. And yet when the books came out, they were always predominantly, I would say, viewed through, if there was a panel about writing about race, I was on that panel. It was that kind of existence. So Hell of a Book became the place where it's like, if you want me to have a discussion about race, and fine, I'll finally do it. And I did.
Yeah.
But how do I balance that? It's challenging because part of me wants to say, screw all of that, screw all that noise. I'm just going to write the story I want to write. But I tried that, and I saw how, like, even when you do that, it still goes through that filter and that lens. And so the other side of that is writing directly about it. And that also is a way to kind of go as well. But maybe I don't want to do that for my entire career. Maybe I do want to just do stories that are not about race, which I definitely do. So trying to find that balance is kind of a daily challenge. I try to just focus on what story do I want to tell, which is a proxy way of saying, what thing am I struggling with on the inside right now? When I wrote The Return, my debut novel, like, I was struggling with the loss of my parents and grief. And so that story is very much about grief and loss and, coping and moving forward. And so when Hell of a Book came around, as I mentioned, I was struggling with, police violence and the consequences of being Black in America. And so that's what that story became about. So I think the core of it is you have to focus on what riddle inside yourself are you trying to solve through words, and let that be the thing that guides you, and don't worry about the rest if you can help it.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that that's why some authors will turn to using a pen name to kind of get assumption out of the reader's mind?
Yes, wholeheartedly. Because the assumption is kind of inescapable, and it's very sad. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I've never done it. Like, I'm a human being. Like, we all do it. It's part of our cognitive kind of existence. Like, our brains all want to reduce and simplify things to as easy a category as possible, because it's more cost effective for the brain. Like, If you can just reduce someone down to a certain type of thing, you don't have to spend time trying to solve the puzzle and figure them out. And so I do the same thing, but it's definitely a reason as an author of, if you're any kind of minority author, again, doesn't matter what flavor that minorityness is, it is something you have to learn to navigate and come to grips with creatively to figure out where you sit on that spectrum of engagement with it, because it will always be there. Like, unfortunately, you cannot option out of it. It will always be there.
Mm-hmm. Carrie from Ascension Parish Library is asking, what obstacles, if any, have you encountered with the shelving of your novels in libraries and schools, especially amid this time of book banning and withdrawal from the National Library System?
I think so far I've been fairly fortunate in that I haven't run into a lot of conflicts in that regard. There's definitely been a couple of libraries that I know who kind of, they won't allow a Hell of a Book to be in there. There's a couple of counties that don't want to, have students reading it. But it hasn't been a huge kind of issue. I mean, don't get me wrong, that's a huge issue in those places, but it hasn't been as widespread as I think I or others may have expected. But I've definitely been a part of trying to, I've gone to a couple of kind of school council meetings, things like that, trying to kind of rectify that and let my voice be heard, because silencing art and silencing people's voices is a very dangerous road to start going down. And I think it's a road that we've been down too many times in America and in other countries as well. And so for me, trying to make sure that doesn't become a recurring thing is part of what we need to all do. I know other authors who have had similar problems. I'm very good friends with an author named Robert Jones Jr., who wrote The Prophets. If you have not read The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr., go out and read it. Robert's an amazing guy, but he and I have discussed this as well. He's had problems with that. His story is, it deals with gay individuals and the topic of gay sex and gay identity and all those kinds of things. But at its core, it is a love story. It is a true love story, and people want to boil it down to other things. No, like The Prophets is about people who love each other, and they just happen to be two men. And for so many people, that becomes a conflict. And I've seen that book be taken out of schools, and I hate it, because again, at its core, it's just about two people who love each other, and that should be something that can be in any library anywhere.
Yep, I agree, and I also agree that is an amazing book. Okay, so Madeline is asking, what is your reaction to white writers creating Black or other minority characters? Do you think that that's problematic?
No, I do not think that's problematic at all. I think that is essential and vital. I know that there was, and kind of still is, like this pendulum swing that occurred where, or kind of maybe it's still occurring, where, certain basically people, because I teach in creative writing, and I've seen it like firsthand with like young writers, where people get very afraid to write about people who don't identify in the way that they identify. And while I definitely understand the basis of that, because for too long, stories of minorities and minority individuals have been appropriated by other cultures. And so the people for whom the story is actually a part of their life have not been allowed to tell their own story. And that is a huge, major problem. And something that we all have to be very diligent about and have to kind of make sure it doesn't occur. Like, everyone should be allowed to tell their own voice. So, however, the other side of that coin is the thing that we do not want to suppress artists to the point where they are afraid or unwilling to tell stories from other points of view. The beauty of writing is the ability to learn to empathize with other voices and other identities. That is one of the most amazing points of watching young writers. Again, I teach undergrad and graduate. I love watching young writers write a story from a character's viewpoint who identifies completely different than they do. And in the act of writing that, they learn something about that culture, about those people. They humanize people who are not like themselves. That is something that we need to encourage. We need to encourage people trying into different spaces and finding out about the lives of people who don't look and act and behave and identify as they do. And so when we start telling, white male writers, you can never write about, minority characters or characters who don't identify as you, what we're doing is we're hindering people's ability to humanize and to empathize through living in the skin of someone else. And again, there's a balance to be struck. We can't go, we spent too many years on the other side, on the wrong side of the scale, where minority stories were appropriated by a lot of white male writers and people weren't allowed to tell their own story. We can't be over here. But at the same time, I don't believe that swinging to the other end of the extreme, where everyone is only allowed to write within the box of their identity, I think that is equally dangerous and counterproductive. I think there is a space in the middle where we learn to empathize with each other and share narratives and build narratives respectfully. Is it challenging? Yes. Is it something that we need to make sure we keep an eye on? Yes. Is it something that can be furthered through discussion and through growth and through working together? Yes. So why don't we do that thing? Yeah, as you can tell, I have a lot of feelings about that topic.
Feelings are great. Laura says, please tell us what you're working on now.
Sadly, Laura, I will not be able to tell you. I'll tell you this. I am working on a novel. That is the only information that I'll give. I am super secretive about projects that I'm still working on. It's not superstition. It's just how my brain works. Like, if I start telling people about a project that's not finished yet, then it starts to sour the project in my head somehow. So I will say I am working on another novel. I am hopefully maybe a couple of months from finishing it. I'm really hoping I can get this thing across the finish line pretty soon. I had hoped to finish it over Christmas break, but I didn't. So now I'm hoping to get it wrapped up in another month or two. But yeah, I'm very much still in the fiction long form game.
Okay, well, we can't wait to see what that is. Chelsea says, I know this is supposed to be questions about writing and the book, but can I ask about the action figure? And are those ships on top of his bookshelf?
Yes. So back there is the robot at the top is a Sentinel. If you're a Marvel X-Men fan, that is a Sentinel robot that I got years ago from a friend of mine, and it's kind of become my totem. So it always sits in my office. The two ships, one of my mentors, a wonderful creative nonfiction writer named Philip Gerard, who mentored me in undergraduate and graduate. He passed away this past year, about a year or so ago now, he passed away. And those are his, he was a huge fan of sailing and boating. And so his wife luckily gave me those to kind of keep as keepsakes, as kind of mementos of his. And so they hang out with my Sentinel now.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and ask my favorite last question, and Cynthia is on the same wavelength as me. She says, do you have a book that has stayed with you over the years or marked you deeply in some way, or a book that you think that everybody should run out to their library and check out immediately?
Yes, I have two books for that. Great question. So the first book will be John Gardner's Grendel. As I mentioned, that's the book that made me start writing. So for me, that's always one. Now, that's not a book for everyone. I will say that. I think it's a unique animal. It doesn't fit everyone. But the other book that I would say I think everyone should go out and read, even though you've probably already read it, you should reread it as an adult, is Lord of the Flies by William Golding. I think it's a bit criminal that book is prescribed in middle school and high school, but then people read it and they don't read it as adults. I think if you read Lord of the Flies as an adult, it is maybe one of the most perfect books ever written. That book, over the years, I read it about once a year. Like that and Grendel, I reread about once a year. And every year that I read Lord of the Flies, it hits me in a different way. It reveals more about humanity and about people than it did the previous year, to the point where it moves me differently every single time. And I think it's amazing to have a book be able to do that.
Wow. Yeah, it's been about 20 years since I've read Lord of the Flies.
Yeah, that's most people. That's most people.
Year of undergrad. So I've got it on my shelf. I'll have to read it again. All right. Thank you for those recommendations.
Yeah,
and thank you so much for joining us today. It's the hour's flown by. It was a super, super pleasure to talk to you for the last hour. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And I also want to extend a huge thank you to all of our viewers for tuning into the Author Talk. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, below the live stream video in the Rate This Program tab, you can find a link to the resources area, which contains a link to Jason's book. We look forward to seeing you all again on February 28th when we chat with New York Times bestselling author Kim Scott about her book, Radical Candor, and again on March 6th when we talk to NPR legal correspondent Nina Totenberg. I am Brandon Adler, and thank you very much for joining us today.